Welcome to Shift, the college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Cassandra with Achievable, and if you're a parent trying to help your student prepare for the ACT, SAT, or CLT without the stress, the sales pressure, or the four-figure price tag, Achievable was built for you. Our courses help students study smarter, stay motivated, and actually retain what they learn, all in a flexible format that fits real family schedules. You can try Achievable free at achievable.me, and if it's a good fit, use code podcast for 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we have David Blobaum with us, and David, I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Cassandra. Yes, I am the CEO of Summit Prep. We have two locations in New Jersey, and we also serve students worldwide via Zoom tutoring, and we focus on the SAT and ACT.
Yeah, fantastic. And thanks for joining us today. So, we have a really interesting topic that we're discussing. And you actually did a report on a study from the UC San Diego that showed a 12% of incoming freshmen need remedial math. So, to start off, can you walk us through what that actually means in practice and why this statistic is catching people off guard?
Yes, so it was a bombshell report, at least in the higher education industry. The Wall Street Journal did a piece called A Math Horror Show. The Atlantic said A Recipe for Idiocracy. Inside Higher Ed did a piece on it, Chronicle of Higher Education. So it really grabbed a lot of people's attention. And to your point, because the data and the figures were so shocking. If we rewind a little bit, in 2016, University of San Diego instituted a remedial math class. So it was about 1% of University of San Diego, not University of San Diego, sorry, University of California, San Diego. Got to make that clear. So it
Yes.
went from, so it's about 1% of students who went to UCSD were put into a remedial math class, and it was high school remediation. Now, fast forward to just 2 years ago in 2024, it had gone from 1% of UCSD students going into remedial math to 12% of students being placed into remedial math. And not only that, but three-quarters of those students, they didn't even place into high school remedial math. They placed into elementary and middle school remedial math. So UCSD had to actually create a new math remediation class for most of those students to remediate not even high school, but remedial math. Some other figures that also really grabbed the public's attention is that of those students who went into the elementary and middle school remediation, 25% of them had a perfect, unweighted 4.0 GPA in high school math. So perfect grades in high school math, but they didn't know high school, middle school, or in some cases, even elementary school math. And that would all be potentially okay if they were able to actually fully remediate the students. But the problem is that when so much remediation is needed, there's just not enough time to get these kids up to speed, especially if they're going to be doing a STEM major. The authors of the report said that, and this is a quote, indeed, there are data that show that few, if any, students who place into Math 2, that's the elementary and middle school remediation, have successfully completed an engineering degree. So even if they were admitted and the admissions team knew that they were aspiring STEM majors, especially engineering majors, really they probably shouldn't have been admitted on that basis because it's setting them up for failure because there's almost 100% chance, at least with engineering, that they won't be able to graduate as engineering majors. And there's a couple causes to this, which is COVID learning loss, grade inflation, and then the test blind admissions. Here, that test blind admissions, probably the admissions committee would have seen that the student was unprepared to be admitted as an engineering major if they had an SAT or ACT score. But instead, again, even perfect unweighted 4.0 GPAs in math weren't enough assurance or an accurate signal that the student knew high school math.
Yeah. So this is huge. This is really shocking information. So I want to dig into some of the causes here. The first one that you mentioned was the COVID learning loss, and I think a lot of people felt that. Can you talk more about how that affected not only grades, but maybe also did lead to some of the grade inflation?
Absolutely. So families have felt the learning loss anecdotally, but it also shows up in the data as well. So there are what's called the Nations Report Card. It's the NAEP scores. And these are longitudinal studies that have been tracking students' progress for decades. According to the Nations Report Card scores, we're at historic lows in reading and math proficiency. So among 12th graders, it's only 35% of 12th grade students were proficient in reading in 2024, and only 22% were proficient in math. So the vast majority of them were not proficient in reading and math by 12th grade. And again, the lowest ever on record. And what's unfortunate is actually we were declining in academic proficiency even before COVID, and then COVID hit and then it really steeply declined across all measures. We have the lowest SAT and ACT scores on record as well. Now, one would think then that grades would decline because if grades are measuring academic preparedness and all the standardized longitudinal measures of academic preparedness show that we're declining in academic preparedness, you would assume grades would decline as well. But no, they actually rose. So today, it's the vast majority of students, and it more or less just keeps going up and up, that the vast majority of students have A averages in high school if they're going on to a university. So in, let's see, it was 1966, it was about 20% of students going into a four-year BA granting university had an A average in high school. So about 80% didn't. Now it's about 80% of students going into those four-year BA granting universities that have A averages. Only about 20% of students don't. So grades are just not nearly as reflective of actual academic preparedness. And that's what the report also showed, that even 4.0 GPAs in high school math didn't mean they knew even elementary or middle school math in some cases.
Yeah, and I guess yes, there are those obvious causes, but I think too, with the pandemic, parents were having to go over homework and really just teach their children during that time. Would you say that schools are maybe like prioritizing pass rates over student success just to level the playing field a little bit?
That's a great point that you bring up. Yes. So a lot of schools during COVID, they instituted no fail policies. So you could literally do nothing and you wouldn't fail. And a lot of other schools, even if they didn't go that far, they would let students retake tests, just not put deadlines on homework, just keep letting students redo homework. And so higher grades were just easier to get. And now we're seeing the downstream effects of that, that when higher grades are easier to get, students don't master the content as much. And we're seeing just how unfair that is to students, because the really low scoring students, they're just pushed along through the system instead of parents really finding out, hey, actually your student is really struggling academically. Surveys show that the vast majority of parents say that if they knew their child was significantly struggling in school, they would take remedial measures. They would have the student go to office hours with a teacher, they would get tutoring for their child, they would help their child more. So when a student is getting a C in a math class, for instance, that is a signal to the parent, hey, we need to do something. An A is not a signal that anything needs to be done. So these parents whose kids are getting sometimes straight A's in math, but they don't know math, that is very unfair to those students and to their parents who think that the kid is doing well in math. It's also unfair to those middle scoring students who they're not pushed to really succeed because the bar is set so low. And then it really robs the highest performing students of their potential because they're not challenged at all. So they're not pushed to succeed more. And there's actually been even more recent research that was just released just last month in March of 2026 from Jeffrey Denning at the University of Texas And he was able to actually quantify some of the harm of grade inflation. That and according to his data, for every about a third of a letter grade that a teacher inflates grades, that decreases one English or math teacher doing that decreases the student's later lifetime earning potential by $2,300. If you extrapolate that out, and all these English teachers, all these math teachers are inflating grades, maybe not just by a third of a letter grade, from like from a B plus to an A minus, it might be B plus to an A in some cases. Now we're really talking about depriving students of lifetime earnings because we're not making sure that they actually learn the knowledge. We're thinking that it's helping them more just to give them good grades, and it turns out that it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think parents have bigger participation in that? I feel like in recent years, it's been parents maybe coming at the teacher like, no, my student actually, like, my child is actually a great student. You're grading incorrectly, and they're battling the teacher on that. And so, do you think a lot of teachers just cave and maybe move that grade up a couple points just to maybe get a parent off their back?
You are so right. And when I talk with teachers, a lot of them will say, look, I'm just not paid to just fight these battles over a B plus to an A minus. And I agree with them. And it would be one thing if the administration at the school really had their backs on this, but so often the administration doesn't. To your point, the administration is looking at these pass rates that if more students graduate from that high school, the administration looks good. It might be it might actually be detrimental to have those high pass rates because we're getting higher pass rates at the expense of not ensuring that students are actually learning, which diminishes the amount that they're learning. Gallup, in partnership with the organization Learning Heroes, surveyed parents, and 90% of them thought that their children were at or above grade level proficiency. So almost every parent thinks that their child is doing well. That's because basically every student is getting A's or some mix of A's and B's. And again, it's just not the case. So teachers really have it rough that, to your point, they're being attacked very often by students. The administration doesn't have their back. And we can also understand, though, why it's happening even from the parent perspective, because they're seeing that there's so much grade inflation at other schools and across the country that then it becomes a very competitive atmosphere where, especially in an age of test optional admissions, where there might not be a test score attached in the college application, what is that college going to go based on? Grades. You're not going to be able to argue with an SAT or ACT score and get that score higher, but you might be able to argue with your child's teacher and get that grade higher. So parents are seeing that they have some leverage to move grades higher for their kid, and they're thinking, hey, this will help my kid be more competitive in college. Even if it does help them get into a better college, that is actually diminishing their earnings overall, and even in some cases their graduation rates from college, because again, they were pushed on and put into harder programs than they could really handle.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. So that's a good segue. I wanted to talk about the equity behind these students and their parents, and parents that have higher incomes, they have more leverage when it comes to paying for these colleges, and those with who are struggling financially, if they're not getting the grades or their grades are higher than they need to be, they're suffering from losing out on financial aid from scholarships. Can you talk about that and like the disparity between those two?
So I think that in general, there is a lot of unequal access across the society, and especially in higher ed. Wealthier students tend to have higher grades because, again, they can get more tutoring, they have more access to help. They tend to take more rigorous courses, so more honors, more AP courses. They do more extracurricular activities because their parents can afford to shuttle them around, send them on internships or summer travel. They have higher quality application essays because there's They can hire an essay editor for their kids. They have higher quality teacher recommendation letters on average because they tend to go to schools where the teachers are coached into how to write recommendation letters, and the teachers are writing longer and more detailed recommendation letters. The wealthy have more athletic recruitment for especially Ivy League sports like squash and fencing. They have a higher likelihood of being a legacy. They have a higher likelihood of being able to demonstrate interest, which a lot of colleges track. So being able to go to that campus and see the school, that gets tracked by the college. It can increase their chances. Higher likelihood of applying early decision, more ability to pay, which most schools also track. And there's just more connections, more likely to be children of faculty, be on dean's list as well. So the point is there's a lot of inequality in the system, which is really unfortunate. SAT and ACT scores, they have a certain amount of inequity in them as well, in the sense that you can get coached for them. But they're still more fair than the more subjective criteria. That the subjective criteria in college admissions, number one, they don't help predict a student's success in college. So why are we really even using them? Essay quality doesn't show up in predicting a student's success at that college. And in contrast, SAT and ACT scores in the latest research are 3.9 times more predictive, even than a student's high school GPA, at predicting a student's first year GPA in college at an Ivy Plus institution. So the research actually show that if we only used SAT and ACT scores, which I'm not saying we shouldn't, we should also take other things into account. But if we only used SAT and ACT scores, the percentage of the wealthiest families in the top 1%, the proportion of them would drop by about a third at those top schools. So we would actually see less preference for wealth if we just use SAT and ACT scores. So most of the inequality is coming from other sources. So while there is a lot of inequality, I think we can focus on how do we make it more fair. I think the way that we make it more fair is we actually do use standardized test scores more. We don't have these test optional schools because the standardized test scores can actually highlight when there is a disadvantaged student who has actually learned the material. And that might not show up in their grades. The admissions officer might look at a disadvantaged student from a disadvantaged school, see straight A's, and have no idea from those straight A's if the student can actually do the work and succeed in an institution. But if those straight A's from that disadvantaged student at a disadvantaged school is paired with a relatively high SAT or ACT score, the college will know that the student can succeed. That's actually an opportunity to help admit that student and help them really for the rest of their life with a degree from a better university.
Yeah. And it's interesting too because college admissions has to change with that too. Understanding what to look at as a college admissions officer, especially when maybe it's a test optional admissions process. So what are like some other key factors? You mentioned writing the essay, but with AI now, how can you even know if this is a true essay? Obviously, there are tools to find AI within the writing, but what are some of the other elements that go into the admissions process that colleges should be aware of?
So I would love to see proctored essays. So the both the SAT and ACT, they do have like the ACT has an optional essay. The SAT actually at the state or district level still has an optional essay as well that districts could opt into. I would love to see those proctored essays reformatted so they're more in the format of what a college application essay would look like. Still, students could still lie about their background and the story that they tell in those essays, but at the very least, we actually know that the student wrote the essay. Whereas, to your point, even if even if a family doesn't hire a editor for those essays, all students can really now use AI. And there's even though some inequity in AI, the pro models of AI, they write much better than the free
Mm.
models. And so if a disadvantaged student is using the free models, those essays are much more likely to actually be flagged by the AI detectors. The $200 a month for some of these AI models, it they can write so convincingly that you wouldn't necessarily catch all of the students who are using AI. And it was actually just last year, Yale rescinded the admission isn't really the right word. They had to kick a student out of the school who had been let in, who just forged everything in her transcript. And so this is one of the very top universities in the world that didn't catch that the student just lied about everything. And it was actually the student's roommate who put two and two together and was like, this just doesn't sound like an authentic story. And when Yale was reached out to for comment, Yale said, in Yale's own defense, was we receive thousands of applications and we rely on the honesty of the applicants and the information provided. That just seems like a terrible system when the stakes are so
Yeah.
high, right? Let's make these at least one essay be proctored so we at least know the student wrote it and that it's the student's, the quality of the essay can be assessed on the merits of the student actually wrote it. Let's have these colleges vet, at least just randomly pick one extracurricular activity for every student you're going to admit and just audit just one to see, did the student actually do that extracurricular activity. Even people have been caught later, not caught during, have been caught later having fabricated their teacher recommendation letters. That they wrote their own teacher recommendation letters, created their own email account for that quote unquote teacher, and submitted their own teacher recommendation letters. It's just mind blowing that at the very top level of college admissions, this is not caught every single time. And
Mhm.
then again, I would say let's go to test required admissions because, again, that's a standardized measure and it's a verified measure that the student actually did the work. And there's not the variability between a student's GPA, where at one school, the GPA might really indicate academic mastery. At another school, it might be more attendance or institutional pressure or pressure from parents to give good grades. So a standardized measure of academic preparedness would go a long way as well to restoring trust to the college admissions process.
Yeah. And once again, it comes back to the inequality of it because, a lot of these students are getting in kind based on lies and other students are not because they only have so many positions. And so that's really unfair. And then it makes me think about the whole college admissions process with what we're talking about with the grade inflation, a lot less acceptance letters for these students, especially those who don't have parents who are maybe well connected or maybe have more money to help with the college prep process. So, would you say that there is maybe a higher rate of dropouts because of this? Or is it just maybe now I'm going to change my major because I don't think I'm actually prepared for maybe what I was interested in, maybe engineering, computer science, something in STEM. Students get to college and they realize, wow, this is way harder than high school. How am I going to adapt? And they like it takes a toll on their confidence a little bit, and then maybe they switch majors because of it.
You nailed it with that second explanation. The data show that people really aren't dropping out at higher rates. And that's actually one of the reasons why we need to be really careful at what research we look at in evaluating the predictive capacity of SAT and ACT scores. So, a lot of people will point to the studies that use first year GPA as the measure of how well did an SAT or ACT score predict a student's academic success at a university. Others will look at graduation rates, 6-year graduation rates. And I would say that looking at first year GPA, it's not perfect. Maybe students who are disadvantaged, they're just adjusting to college and that takes longer. So first year GPA might not capture everything that we wanted to capture, but it's, I would argue, far superior to looking at 6-year graduation rates for the reason that you just described. Because those students who are admitted, and the college admissions officers are generally trying to do a really good job and admit students who are going to succeed. But with limited information, you can only make decisions as good as the information that you get. And when GPA is just not telling the story, you're just limited in the quality of decisions that you can make. So those students who were maybe in pre-med and doing terribly, or were in some really hard STEM majors and are doing terribly, you're exactly right. They transfer to easier majors. And so the data show that they're very likely to graduate, but just not graduate in their desired major. So those 6-year graduation rates, they're basically the same, irrespective of SAT or ACT scores at an institution. But the first year GPA, which actually picks up the GPA before a lot of students transfer out of their majors that were too hard for them, that really shows that how helpful and predictive SAT and ACT scores are. And that's what I think we should be measuring at. How successful was the student at that university in the major that they wanted to graduate in?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so it takes a little longer. They maybe have more student loans now because they were in school longer. And then now that affects them once they graduate. They're getting into their chosen career field. And now they have to navigate the financial aspect of that. And you mentioned earlier how a lot of people take a hit on their income because of all of this that we've been talking about that happened back in middle school, high school. So it's really just shocking to see how in all of these years it plays out in once they have their career, they're getting jobs, they're not making the money that they thought they would. They have these high student loans that are going to take even longer to pay off because they're not making as much. So I guess, like, where do we go from here? Like, what is the next best step to help this timeline look a little more promising for these students?
Actually, just to add a little bit more despair before we get to the optimism,
Yeah.
to reinforce what you're saying, to add more detail to the causal mechanism, and you're absolutely correct. It admitting students who are not prepared to succeed in their desired major, it delays the time that they're in college, which delays the time until they're earning money, and it increases their student loan debt. And tragically, this is again from the University of California, San Diego report. It's very often the last math class in a sequence for a major that the students fail out of. So they might have been progressing for a year or more as a biology major, as a math major, as an engineering major, and it's that last class they just cannot pass. So all those credits, maybe not all the credits, but a lot of the credits are unlikely to transfer to whatever major they go into. So you're absolutely correct in pointing out that there's a very high price that students pay for not having been properly vetted, which I think then brings us to properly vetting. But really, we need to change education in our country, because set aside that, yes, we should properly vet students for college, we need to do a better job at educating students from grades 1 to 12, because we see that we're at the NAEP scores measure the academic proficiency of students in 4th grade, in 8th grade, and in 12th grade. We're at historic lows on all of those. So we know that we need to improve the quality of education in our country. And I'm in standardized testing, so perhaps it's just my bias that my mind goes to standardized testing, but I would love to I would love for parents to get accurate information from the school. I don't see how we're going to turn the tide with grades. And standardized test scores have been so maligned in the public perception that a lot of the data show that actually parents listen more to the grades because that seems more accurate. It's not just, a 2-hour long test. It seems like it's a year-long assessment and many tests. So the grade seems more accurate. But I would love for schools to, next to the student's math grade, which might be whatever it is, an A, put their percentile according to a standardized measure of that student's academic preparedness in math, in English. So then the parent can see both data points at the same time and have a better understanding of how academically prepared is my child. So I think first we need to provide accurate information to parents, and it's those parents who really is ultimately up to them to be advocating for the quality of education for their kids. And then maybe you see parents say, "Hey, these grades are like, what are you doing with these grades?" Maybe that actually flips the script and be like, "Stop giving my kid A's if they're in the bottom 10 percentile on math. Like, the grade might actually seem silly then and might put downward pressure on grades." So again, I might be biased because I'm a hammer and so everything looks like a nail of standardized testing. But I think that's one way that might work or might contribute to improving the quality of education overall. And then just to go back to, I think we need to properly vet students before we let them into programs that might be to their detriment. There's a understandable and there's a good emphasis on access in education, but it has come at the detriment of success. So I really personally don't agree with colleges that really trumpet how much access they give without telling us the success rates of those students. The analogy I would give is, don't tell me who gave access to driving a car to. Tell me, did they get to their destination safely and on time? Now, if the vast majority of them are not, so according to the University of California data, students who are in the bottom 25th percentile based on SAT scores, when SAT scores were mandated, they're only about 25% of them are graduating in STEM. 75% of them are not able to graduate in STEM. So when 75% of students are given access to failure, I don't see that as success. I don't see that as something to celebrate. And I would say we need to properly vet students and not just give them access to higher education, but access to a successful experience in higher education. And I think you can only do that with standardized test scores, helping college admissions officers make good decisions.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight. And like you said, it's all intertwined, right? Everything prepares you for the next step in your education and then later in your career. So it's a big overhaul to try and change the whole education system, but it does feel maybe somewhat necessary at this point. And it's going to take a long time to do that because there's a lot of elements that go into that. But I guess I'll just ask, is there anything that you wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
Just the importance of education. The only reason we have so much progress and so much technological progress and the progress we've had in technology and medicine is because of education. It's our ability to pass on the knowledge of previous generations and then let the new generations build on that knowledge. So if we're going to continue to succeed economically as a country, we need to succeed academically as a country. And there's a lot of focus on the stress that students are under, but I think personally, it will be much less stressful for students overall and better for them if their earning potential isn't diminished. If our country isn't sliding academically and then economically, we don't look at other countries a lot, but it's pretty astounding that we have among the shortest college entrance exams in the world. The SAT and ACT are only about 2 hours now. You look at other countries, and in China, it's a 9 hour exam. In Germany, it's an 8 hour exam. In the UK, some of these students doing a lot of A level subject tests, they could be taking up to 30 hours of entrance exams for college. So the rest of the world, especially the most economically successful nations, they tend to have much more rigorous academic standards. And so we have, I think, would be my thesis, that we've been able to coast on the academic rigor and the innovation that we have had in the past. And I think our country has a very entrepreneurial spirit. I would assume that the innovation will continue at least for a while, but it's very hard to keep fueling innovation if you don't have the knowledge base there. And we see that the knowledge base is slipping away. So I would just encourage anyone, get involved at your school, get involved in the PTA, really advocate for standards. Don't take the short-term view of trying to get a student's grade higher. Take the long-term view of trying to get their knowledge and skill higher.
Yeah, that's a great point and really good advice. And yeah, this is such an important conversation. So thank you so much for chatting with me today about it.
It's my pleasure.
This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Cassandra from Achievable with David Blobaum. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT, SAT, and CLT courses at achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.